the Atlantic Ocean and what it does to the west coast of Africa is intriguing. And that's probably what we're going to be talking about in some respects, for the history of this part of the country and this part of the continent, and how we can really sort of understand one particular interesting piece of work and how that dovetails into understanding history and bettering our understanding of history. So I want to make it very clear, we shouldn't pretend that we're here for any other reason than the pioneering work of Ademide, and I'm going to be using first names. Imagine Lagos, mapping history, place and politics in a 19th century African city, which has just been released, and it's making the rounds quickly. But we're fortunate to have you with us in Lagos. I say it's pioneering because the approach that you've used has brought out the beauty of additional sources. You've combined some traditional newspapers, letters, maps, no, I say maps, newspapers, letters, diaries, and other contemporary primary and secondary sources. But most intriguingly, you brought in this spatial understanding, this historical source called maps and other imagery. So tell us about your intellectual journey in this book.
Okay, well, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so glad that we're doing this in Lagos, on Lagos Island. And as you said, we're among friends. So it's really an honor for me to be here to discuss my book with such amazing people who have really been pivotal in making this book possible. I mean, they might have my name on it, but obviously this is not a labor of an individual person, right? So I feel like I'm so thankful to be able to be here to have this conversation with people who were talking to me about this work before it became the project that it is now. So I'm really thankful and happy about that. So to talk about the book, I'm somebody who, grew up in Lagos, the usual thing, went to school here for a long time, but at the same time, I never did any history, right? So for me, I didn't really know much about Lagos. Yoruba culture is very powerful, so there's a lot of cultural cues that I did have, but nothing really historical, understanding the history of this place. And it's only until I left the country and people started asking me about where I was from, I realized I really had no information. And so then, but I was one of those people who was tracked into STEM. So I was an engineer doing architecture, all of those things. And how this happened is I was working in this architectural firm, and basically we were doing work on Lagos. It was all like post-oil boom Lagos, very sort of dark, the kind of dark early democracy Lagos. And I realized that there must be more to this place than just the doom and gloom of, post-oil boom, are we going to be democratic or not? So I started doing all this research in the Netherlands, and I realized I wanted to know more, and I wanted my friends to know more, and I wanted people around me to know more. So then I started doing this research. I ended up getting a PhD in history. And to get to the maps, I was somebody who was a classically trained historian in that what we look for is documents, right? We look for things that are written down. So with the training that I had, the first place they sent me to is England. And I was always uncomfortable with starting my work on Lagos in England. So all of us who are, so I first met Professor Sani at the National Archives in London, in Kew Gardens. So, but then I would tell my parents I'm working on Lagos history. They're like, why are you in England? And I was like, well, and it's hard to explain, but because I'm interested in after working on 20th century Lagos for a while, I realized that, doing a little bit of research in the Netherlands, I realized that the real story of Lagos, as far as I was concerned, to understand the 20th century, we had to understand the 1870s, the 1860s, the 1850s and 40s. But then all those documents are in Kew Gardens. They're in the British Library. They're the Royal Geographical Society. So, then I would try to come to Lagos and try to do research here. But, when I was still starting this project, it was very like, we need documents. And one day, actually, by a happy accident, I was waiting for my documents in Kew Gardens. Yeah. And you
tell the story in the book, but yes, please tell it. Yeah.
So don't worry, I won't take too long. So the point about this is that this is probably in like 2010 or 2011. Kew Gardens is extremely well organized. It's a really beautiful, well-structured place. And I was waiting for my documents, and I noticed that they had something called the map room on the 3rd floor. And I was like, what on earth is in the map room? And what I found there, as I say in the book, really changed the trajectory of my work, because I went there and I discovered they had all these incredible maps, not just of Nigeria, but of Lagos. And in the book, I talk about how I've categorized these maps into 8 different kinds, because I talk about how the maps do different things. I talk about, because I'm now a historian of maps and map making, I talk about how some of them are intimate maps, and then they talk about relationships, like people are having fights, they're having arguments. Some of them are about territory, they're about British expansion. Some of the maps are about race, Black people live here, white people live here. Some of them really engage with our myths about Lagos, what are the original quarters of Lagos, Olobo, here, this and that. And I found that the maps have so much information, and because of and then there was a really incredible, the cover is from a trigonometrical survey that was done in 1891 in Lagos. And these maps are so huge. Each one is probably about maybe it's hard to say, maybe 2 meters across and 1 meter across. And the level of detail you can see on the cover, you can see street names, people, fetish shrine, mosques, church. 1891. And so there was this incredible survey of Lagos with incredible detail. So what I ended up doing was, because of my former training, I started realizing that not only are these maps information, I can actually draw new maps of Lagos. So part of what I do is really trying to get people to imagine the city as it could be. And I'm really interested in the general population. There's a lot of work done on the more elite Nigerians, Lagosians, that kind of thing. But what I wanted to do was talk about the rest of the people who are here, who tried to make Lagos their home, people who were born here, people who came back here, people who were enslaved here. And so what I do in my work is that I try to get people, as I said, to try to understand the city, because when you read history books about Lagos, it's almost like you can't feel the city, you can't feel that energy, the pain, the pace, the sound, the noise, all of that. It's really missing from our histories of Lagos. And I really wanted to bring that back. So you'll see some of that messiness in the way that I show the book. And then the final thing I'll say about the maps is, after making maps for so long and really thinking about, things like Elegbata Creek that no longer exist, all we have now are just the street names or the lake. I was doing all this work mapping the city, but I felt like people weren't so excited about the historical maps when I would show them. I'm very lucky to be part of the Lagos Studies Association, where we are in Lagos every year. Shout out. Yes, but we're here every year. We're here at UNILAG. We do our work here. And I realized that the historical maps are still very, people are alienated from them. I spend a lot of time with them, but they're not really engaging with this. And I realized that the most popular version of Lagos people know as a map is a Google map. So I started layering, because of Uber, Bolt, all these things. So I started layering historical information. And I realized one day that I would have to be brave and go into Lagos Island, walk around and try to find, and I remember I told you about this when I started this project, and everybody was like, what are you doing? I was like, no, I want to write about the history of the tram. I'm going to go look for the tracks. I'm going to go and look for the pieces. I'm going to go and look for what we can find. And so to end this story with the book, I remember we're in Ekwetedo, and I was with my research partners, and we were at the intersection we looked up and we were on Omididu Street. And I was like, how peculiar. I wonder what this means. And then we got to the intersection and we got to Inobere right there. And I thought, what is going on? What do these street names mean? Because I read a lot about fires, and I was like, is this about a fire? And then you go a little bit further, you see Inosa, but there's a lot of arguments about whether it's a personal name. So I was like, is this a story about the fire in the streets? Then I started thinking, what other stories are there? So my research partners and I walked all over many, many places. We kept walking until the pandemic stopped us. And what we realized is that there's evidence that John Payne named the streets of Lagos in 1868. And what he did first, he left us an incredible record of Yoruba names, talking about people, places, smallpox, all kinds of Orisha, all kinds. So he very specifically named all the streets in Lagos Island. So what I do in the book is I use this as an archive, and I realized that if I had started here, I would have a Lagos version of the history rather than starting in Kew. So when you look at the book, when I had to rewrite this with my editor and all the support, every chapter of the book starts with a different intersection in Lagos Island that is linked to the history. It's linked to the history, whether it's a bombardment, it's remaking, it's about slavery. So every chapter will tell you that our history begins here. So it took me a while to get there, and also telling the story. So
I'm going to ask you to read a bit of it, but before I do that, I just want to leave something with all of us, because I'm going to make us all come back to it. My favorite phrase in this book, and I've read it, is where she uses as a subtitle, landscape and geography as archives. I mean, she's talking about a source. And she takes, this is now not ordinary material for a historian. Landscape and geography as archives. So the repository of information that the landscape and the geography gave her, which is a very unique thing. So I think I'm good as a source and other sources. I think when we do some round robin, we'll do that. But let David just read
Okay,
section I've picked. It's you didn't pick this part.
no worries.
So it's just,
So,
do you want me to show you marked on mine?
so yes, so page 9, each map. Okay, yes. So, I wrote in the book on page 9, each map represents a dialogue, each map that I make actually in the book represents a dialogue with the past and the present. Historical spatial data are not as effective without the context of Lagos Island. Each new analytical map in the book responds to this book's spatial queries about history, place, and archiving the past, with the data that determine the spatial consequences of the new political, economic, and cultural actions that happen in Lagos, like war, colonialism, and commerce, and including tragically, the buying and selling of people.
And it shows her methodology. It involved this questioning the sources that she had. And I think, why don't I start with you, Halima Titi?
Okay.
Which one?
Yeah. You know, I have that. This one, yeah.
Yeah. You have a manuscript that I came across. What was it called? It
On
was
cemeteries?
no. Is that the same one as Decolonizing?
Oh, that's my book, Decolonizing the City. Yeah, that's the book that I'm working on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Decolonizing cities.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the one on cemeteries.
Yes,
That-
yeah, that just came out, yeah.
That's another look at a different source
Mhm.
of history. So we're having such radical changes in historians using these collateral. What's that like? I mean, could you use a unique perspective?
Mhm.
How does that? Did it give you another dimension, or is it just same as usual?
Okay, absolutely. I think in terms of my own, I'm going to start my book, Manuscript Decolonizing the City, Popular Politics and the Making of Post-Colonial Lagos, 1941 to 1976. I think like Ademide, you know, we are all kind of trained to begin in the archive.
Okay.
Exactly, kind of begin in the archive. It's like the really place where you are supposed to find the sources. And I also did my work in the same way too. I went to the National Archive, I went to the Ibadan Archive. And over the course of also doing the research, I collected a lot of stuff, petitions, newspaper, I did oral interviews. I also look at, you know, because I'm interested in social history. So that's where my source space is. But I think, you know, given the kind of book that I'm trying to write is really thinking about how the Lagosians experience and shape the transformation of Lagos from being a colonial city to being the capital of post-colonial Nigeria. What were the ways in which we were imagining new policies? How did they contest colonial norms? And how are they trying to make the city livable for themselves? And thinking about it from the perspective of asking for municipal infrastructure, contesting housing demolition, also demanding political self-determination. So I'm really trying to capture a different way of thinking about the people of Lagos in multiple dimensions as political actors and agents, and in thinking about their investment in different spheres of the city, because I think, you know, in African history and in thinking about this work, there's always a kind of like the idea that people are not directly demanding things from the government, that they're relying on patron-client politics, that it's corruption, and that it's all of this indirect way of demanding resources.
But a direct question for you,
Yeah.
if I can just interrupt.
Yeah.
Do you feel that if you hadn't adopted this collateral, this
Yeah.
broader set of sources, do you feel that you would have missed some depth in your scholarship if you'd kept just to
Yeah, and I think, you know, doing the book has.
I think this point
Yes.
that she experienced it by walking. and
Yes,
walking-
exactly. Yeah,
walking
yeah,
photography.
exactly.
I found that very
Yeah,
interesting.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I had to do doing the interview. I realized that also through the act of like moving about different part of Lagos, I've been able to discover things like, for example, Port Novo Market Street, where an uprising against the housing demolition happened in the 1950s. This is now what they call Habibuki streets, but it was really at Port Novo Market Street, and Port Novo Market Street is a place that has existed since the 19th century, where people of Port Novo would bring food to the Lagos. So that's like the major side of the uprising, and I had somebody take me there, and there's a sign that says Market Street at the moment.
Yeah.
That's the only sign that I can ever find to see like it actually
Yeah,
existed there. So I think it's
The Port
important.
Novo is gone,
Exactly,
just Market.
yeah, and it's just Market Street. So I think going back to Ademide's point, I think the idea of the city as an archive is a big part of what she's, the contribution that is made. And it's also for me really critical in terms of like, what does it mean to actually go beyond, like the people that I find in my archival research, for example, like Dr. Lauren Nimbe or Madam Abiodun Ogunjobi, which a lot of people don't know about. What does it mean to actually go to the places where they've been? She was a market woman at Sabo Market. I've been to Sabo Market to interview people who actually knew her, which I was very surprised. You know, I spoke to someone who remember her, you know. Yeah, being, the head of the market organization, she went with Dr. Olorinbe in 1954 to England to protest the demolition of Central Lagos. And again, this was a moment within the issue that was radical, because she became the first market woman to actually become part of an international delegation in 1954. So I think, in terms of what you asked, we really have to go beyond the idea of going to the archive, but actually thinking about when we engage the city itself, what are the ideas that we find? How do we also, when we think about the margin, exactly, when we think about the margin, we find one name that could become the source of so many information. If you really take seriously the investigative part of really trying to search, and not really believe that because you think that everything has changed, it's not there. And I think that's really what we miss. We think that because things have been built upon, people have they have new houses, it's not the same anymore. It's actually not true. If you look carefully, you can actually find it.
Still all there.
Yeah, exactly.
Professor Sani, in 3 weeks' time, Professor. You've always, in your line of work, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, you've used people as archives in some of your work, and you've used oral traditional history to corroborate or to sometimes correct, and sometimes even inquire further and deeper, and that's led you into different directions. Again, this is all innovative. Half a century ago, the academics before the group that returned in the 60s were told that those were not veritable sources of, we were told that we didn't have history because we couldn't so how would you evaluate what two ladies have talked about, about alternate sources of history?
Like we have always history is not static in the sense of it, and we have varieties of sources to interrogate with. It is from that perspective that we should be looking at different sources aside from what we used to know in the local environment. Historians have always relied on what you have referred to as oral sources, as oral information, oral tradition as a major source of history. And unless we are able to use that, we may also miss some of the things that has actually happened in the past. Historians believe that history, as I have said, is all about ideas of people, interactions over time that demands various sources, because history itself is something that people believe should not just be what you hear or what people say, but it's a combination of activities over time that makes history. And if we can go by AH's perception, there are information that are lying down somewhere that people have not tapped. These are the kind of things that they have bringing into historical studies that we are seeing. But we cannot also remove the importance of oral sources, despite its many limitations. Despite its many limitations, we cannot remove the fact that we can get information through oral sources. But as they have done, which appears to be innovative, looking at maps, looking at
cemetery records.
Yes, cemeteries. Even some other things that we cannot even recall that exists in the past. Looking at all of this makes history livable, makes people come about the idea that when we have missed, it was through your book that I had a clear glimpse, seriously, of the tram. I once lived at Ashobon Street, and they called that place Ojuera.
You never knew what?
Yes, I never knew. But I realized in the course of my findings that the tram passed through a section of Church Street by that Ashobon area. In fact, Entering out of Bon, the pedestrian side of Bon is that you will see two rails put on that as a kind of historical reminder of what that place had been in the past.
Incredible.
It's really terrible. We say it's a discovery. I mean, I remember the first time I spoke to you, you were telling me about Idumagu Lake. And you know, when my dad used to tell me stories about his youth, he would say that on Malo way, they would go and swim, and they were banned from doing it, but they would do it on their way back from school. And I said, but this was on Lagos Island. And he said, he would say yes. And so they said, they'd go and swim and get home late and get beaten for going to swim. So he was obviously talking about a lake that didn't exist. But the young boy that I was, I never interrogated. And I looked at the stories and I said, this guy, I mean, really? Are you so when Ademide was telling me about these sand-filled and reclaimed areas that have been overtaken and how the maps were talking about these areas, I thought that was really, really good. I mean, what else did you, before I come to Chevy, what else did you find that was stunning? Can you single out any one thing? Just tell us one thing.
I mean, there's just so much. Going back to, you know, the toponyms and what we call things, Yoruba itself, as you're saying, Prof, is like an incredible source if we just pay attention. You know, even like, so I have maps that talk about the topography, you know, where the contours of the land, like where the land rises, where it goes steeply into the water. All of that is already recorded in Yoruba. Okay, this one, that one. But to me, the most striking story I can tell about the maps, and you know, the story your father is telling you, is absolutely true. All that's there now, it used to be Reclamation Road, and then now it's like Idumago Lane or something. And there used to be bridges, so Avenue, thank you. So they actually just wrote an article about all the bridges that used to bridge all these old lagoons that were there. So for me, the most striking story is that I remember hearing about the bombardment of Lagos when I was doing my PhD, and I was shocked that Lagos was bombarded twice in 1851, and I've never heard of this. Like, how is this possible that the city was bombed? It turned out this was something that happened quite frequently on the coast with the British cruisers. And so for me, I was just so taken with that story that, you know, the city could have been destroyed and rebuilt. So actually Lagos was constantly being redone and rebuilt. And what really struck me in the sources was that one of the captains on the ship wrote a letter that he tried to bomb Olobo and Faji and all those places, but the city was saved by a lake and a creek. And I was like, how curious, I wonder what this means. And then it just stayed with me for a long time. And I always tell people that the people that bombarded Lagos, in their maps, they wrote their names all over the city. So if you go to Wilmot Point, he was one of the captains on the ship that bombarded in 1851. So it's our history is everywhere. And I remember when but you see, it took me a really long time to understand that. And so I remember when I looked at this 1891 map, I saw a lake and a creek. And I was like, no way. Could it really be? Because right now, if you go there, you see Lake Street and you see Elegbata Street, Creek. And for the longest time, I've been trying to find the meaning of Elegbata. Like, what does this mean? I've asked so many people, nobody knows. Maybe somebody here knows. But I don't know yet. But the point, so exactly, but so some people say that, but it's been really hard to find. We'll talk about this afterwards then. But the point is that I looked on the maps, and you know, I draw these maps that compare contemporary Lagos to the historical Lagos. And I was able to, you know, so I was standing there at the corner of Lake and Elegbata Street. And it was just so stunning to me that the street, when you look at it from the aerial perspective, it curves. The street follows the same curve as the creek does. And people may not know that they're living on an old creek. And I'll end with this quote by Toni Morrison, where she talks about water remembers. So when you look at the way that Lagos floods, it floods where a lot of those old creeks were. Look at Isalegongo Creek, Idumago Creek and Lagoon, that was quite huge. And if you look at Lagos from the Google, if you look at the Google map of Lagos, you can almost trace out. If you know what you're looking for, you can trace out the old island, and I do this in the book. So it's really incredible to me that it was all just there. And so that's why this is the cover. And that's my favorite story about geography that, you know, I've been to Lake, I've been there, we captured all these images, and it's all just right there in front of us. Yeah. If we know how to look at it.
Yes, we know. Imagine Lake. That's a great title. Dr. Jim. So, you know, this that drives me to the interrogation of existing sources and how accurate over time or inaccurate or needing of corroboration the accounts of our history have been. Because here we're talking about discoveries, okay? So, but there's been certain staples, certain basic secondary sources that people have relied on and built their own scholarship on. How serious do you think the misadventure of some of our history?
I think Alima and Professor Adelusi represent two episodes of sources of Lagos history. Now, she is using cemetery to interpret the post-colonial realities of Lagos while she's talking about the working cartography in the 19th century, telling us that looking at Lagos itself, Lagos tells its own story if you look at Lagos very well. But I think everybody, we built our foundation on Lucy and Berkeley Wood over the years. Before 19th century, Christian Mann, delved into the colonial judicial record to tell us about the struggle over properties, and I interpret the
Brilliant book.
capitalist nature or phase of Lagos history. But for me, events in Lagos in the 19th century and outside Lagos, there's a nexus, because Lagos, I don't believe Lagos existed then in a vacuum. So we need to start questioning the two sources, the two prominent sources of Lagos history, Lucy and Berkeley, by looking at the surroundings of Lagos. What does it tell us about the accuracy of Lucy? For me, Lagos is beyond Lucy. Lagos is beyond Berkeley. But how do we get into that lost phase of Lagos history? It's what Prof. She has given us an example of inventing
Different
techniques
different routes,
to
different
recover
techniques.
a substantial, silent history of Lagos. In what this guy, Matthew Gandhi, will call historiography of absence. Lagos 17th century, we are yet to know about Lagos of 16th century, 15th century, because I believe there is Lagos of 15th century, there's Lagos of 14th century.
Absolutely.
So how do we recover these centuries of Lagos history? She has shown an example of great, imagination, invention, technology, bringing all these together to tell us about what ordinarily you cannot find in the archives. Because the Europeans who document our history only document what they want us to know. They will document what will shape our identity as Africans, not as human beings, but as Africans. Now she is telling us, walking around the city tells its own stories. Then how do we tell the story of pre-European, phase of Lagos history? So I want to believe that Lucy and Berkeley Wood actually represented 19th century, nothing beyond that.
And Berkeley Wood is quite he's almost confessionary in his opening when he says he was asked to write it by John Jimenez, who was the administrator of Lagos at the time. You were asked to write it by the British administrator. Really, what value could you really do for us beyond what the administrator wanted to hear? And he said, well, and I couldn't find anything beyond no stories told me anything beyond 1700 anyway. So he obviously blanked out anything before 1700. So we really need to, and going back to my favorite phrase in Ademide's book, the landscape and geography as archives, sedimentology, and the study of earthworks. The anthropologists will tell you that people buried living things. So you bury your pots, or they'll get buried by weather and circumstance. And so for instance, the work of the fantastic professors in the archaeology department of the University of Ralph Alabi and their work in Badagry shows human activity there 3,000 years, and using earthworks and ditches and groves and things that anthropologists will tell you show human activity,
Mhm.
but the human and naked eye. So I think there's a wider.
I think coming from our book again, just strike me now about Elegbeta
Mhm.
and being from issue.
We should have talked before.
Yeah.
You know, now,
Should have talked again.
do we have issue in 19th century Lagos? Yes.
Sure.
How did you came about 19th century Lagos?
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the history of issue, vis-a-vis the Yoruba history,
Maybe you should tell our viewers what issue is.
issue is, I don't want
It's a
to have
god.
this,
It's
it's
not-
a god.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's one of the Yoruba gods.
Yoruba gods,
Yoruba
yeah,
deity,
yeah.
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 Even though it's often mistranslated as devil,
As
but it's
devil.
not
Yeah.
devil.
There you go.
So
Exactly, yeah.
if we have issue in Lagos in 19th century to the extent of having Elegbeta streets.
I think
Elect-
it's
elect-
a.
elect- elect-
Elegbeta,
I think
but it's always outside.
The outside.
Outside.
And then Samantha.
Yeah.
One suggested it may be issue Legbar that was
Mm.
spelled wrongly on the maps, because you do see that spelled wrongly,
Mm.
but it's really hard to find evidence of this from the 19th, well, I found it hard, but sorry.
Okay,
I
now,
interrupted you.
issue Elegbeta is not,
It has been one of the deities worshipped by all of his children.
Consistently over the same, and you will find that the traditional, the Boloye still today, the chiefs still use that phrase. So I'm at the possibility of a
Which
mistake.
phrase?
Elect-
Legbar.
elect-
Legbar.
the point I'm trying to raise is, if you have issue Elegbara or Elegbata, the case would be, definitely issue is not a coastal deity.
Hmm. Interesting, why not?
It is not, because what is, when you have a coastal city, you probably have Yemoja, Omofi, Olokun.
There's Ojo
right?
Olokun Street.
Yeah,
the
so
palace.
in other words, for you to have issue in a coastal city of Lagos,
Interesting.
it must have been brought from the hinterland,
Hmm.
not by that generation,
Maybe
not.
to some extent, sorry.
Hold on a minute.
The Eyo, for example,
Mm.
Ajimorisha,
Mm.
there's a lot of contention in terms of like when the Eyo actually came to Lagos.
Yes.
And then because, the Eyo is also very much associated with like burials, because when you have an important chief that dies, that's when the Eyo comes out. And then after a long period of time, sometimes we'll bring the Eyo half another important person,
Mhm.
right? And there's all these stories about this Olubani woman who's an incredible woman,
Mhm.
that she might possibly have brought Eyo into Lagos.
Mm.
There's exactly, that's
Oh,
possible, so. I don't know, I mean, I said it's possible, I'm not
You see,
saying.
That's it, we
No,
very,
you said-
what I'm saying.
Anyway,
Okay,
the
okay.
point I'm raising is
Yeah.
the material culture.
Okay.
Looking at
Exactly.
Lagos
Okay.
history from the
Yeah,
material
exactly,
culture.
yeah.
Because if you study the material culture and the origin of those particular cultural objects,
Mhm.
will tell us much about the history of
Yeah,
the location.
yeah, yeah,
Interesting.
Probably an interaction between Lagos
and.
as a coastal city
Mhm.
and the hinterland,
Mhm.
or an existing civilization that is yet to be accounted for. Because they should go beyond 19th century Yoruba civilization,
Exactly, yeah,
right?
yeah,
And issue is not something you found, you establish on your own.
yeah.
It's an inherited deity.
Mhm, yeah.
Okay,
If you-
okay, I see Jima's point, that it shows a history of a bunch of people
Migration.
by far older than Buckley Wood.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, can I respond? I want to build up on what Dr. Jima said about Lucy. Because I agree with you that people take Lucy at face value, right?
Mhm.
There's always this idea that, it's not really, you can't investigate it, or you can't think about its fallacy, right? And it's like, it's a go-to source, it's a classical source when it comes to short labor. But I think we need to think about its methodology.
Mhm.
How and why did he write this book, right?
Mhm.
And the methodology is really critical because it helps us to also think about what is missing, the voices that have been obscured.
Mhm.
For example, the first Yoruba version published in 1914, he says it in the preface. It was like, I wrote this book, he was a Roman Catholic headmaster.
Mhm.
The Roman Catholic priest came to him and said, we need the short pamphlet for the people to
Absolutely.
learn the history of it.
Okay.
But we also have to think about, he talks about the defects that other people have to help him to correct.
Mm.
Like the editor of Wero Yoko, he said one of the key people that help him to correct the text. So we need to ask ourselves through this process of the creation of this text, right? What were the things that were taken out? Of course, it's hard to understand, but one way in which you can think about it is, let's think about the Wero Yoko itself, right?
Mm.
Which kind of archive does it present when it comes to history of Lagos? How, to what extent is it conversation with the issue of Lagos that we know, what we're taking out of the issue of Lagos that could possibly be the wearing report.
So
There's also all that question that we can think about as a way of enhancing, Losi's book, which I agree needs to be critiqued, but we also can think about Losi as offering us a trace to think about other parts of Lagos history.
but not a staple. It
Of
should
course,
never
it
be treated as a staple.
You see,
But I think about him
I disagree
in that
a bit of trying to repair Lucy.
I'm talking about repairing Losi.
Yeah, I
I'm not
understand.
talking about repairing Losi. I'm talking
To
about a
me-
way to expand.
Yeah,
what we know.
what
I'm
I
not-
want
yeah.
to look at, I look at Lucy as not a starting point,
Mhm.
but an episode in Lagos history. What I am after is how do we account for those lost centuries?
Let's read.
That's my-
let's
Let's read to the back,
Yeah,
because Lucy himself was commissioned by the Roman Catholic,
Yes,
by the
yeah.
missionaries
Right.
who are part of the establishment.
And
If you
Wood,
look-
and Wood was
and Wood.
commissioned by.
And if you look
by
at
the
Lucy,
administrator.
if you look at Lucy and Wood, the complete history of material culture of the people is missing.
It led me to the material culture.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, for example, the story between Adele and Oshiloka, right? We tend to think about it as this political conflict, but there's a funeral element to it. There's a material culture element to it. Adele, for example, when he was forced out of Lagos, he took his father's call with him and took it to Badagry. What does that mean that, when we think about the, burying bodies and all this stuff, right? We think about the idea like ancestors are formed because they have to be in the house. But he took his father's call with him to Badagry and ensured that his father's call had to be buried in Benin. He figured out a way to do it. And it's not just Lucy who talked about this. I think Richard Lander, who saw him in Badagry, said, at this point, Adele's father's call has been buried in Benin. Because by having this call, that gave him legitimacy to still be able to claim to be Oba.
Because
So
it was
that-
connected to the previous one.
Exactly. That's a trace to the material culture that I'm telling you about that. It's because of that story of reading Lucy that I was like, wow, this is how I can think about the history of Lagos differently to connection to Benin, how people also manipulate funerary tradition
Wow.
as a means of asserting power.
Wow.
And that's what I'm talking about. We can lead us to other
Okay,
things.
let's see what
Yeah.
you thought.
I agree with you. I agree.
Add, and this is something we came up with, but also the thing about Lucy's book is, think of all the Oriki, all the poems, all the things that he archived in that way, where a lot of people might not have seen that as valuable. And I'm not saying what he wrote down was the definitive version, but at least it's something that was in circulation.
Mhm.
So for a lot of the Oriki that are attached to different people, I think Lucy's work is an important archive, but we have to understand
Yeah.
the moment it was created, because actually there are earlier versions of the history of Lagos. So for instance, the Nigerian Pioneer, I don't know if you've seen it, but there are these serialized histories of Lagos that come from 1914 and 1915. Of course, Nigerian Pioneer, we have to understand, it's also a government-supported paper. So that's an issue,
Yeah.
right? But on the other hand, through a lot of the older papers, people are constantly
Right.
writing what they think is the history of Lagos.
Yeah.
And in fact, even like, I know our dear friend who's passed away, Paul Sipodun, he wrote
Yeah.
about
Different.
Itao, remember Itao, the shrine of Itaomi, or
Okay.
something like that.
Autonomy.
Otaomi, sorry,
Yeah.
yes, thank you. There's actually newspaper records of, the fire on the lagoon and how the people who worshipped.
Otaomi.
Guys,
My Yoruba
Otaomi.
Exactly. Not stupendously excellent, but
Moving
there
on,
are all
the
these, there are all these recordings in the
Yeah.
papers about what happens and, this efflorescence on the lagoon and all of that. So there's a lot of information in newspapers that we'll talk about that later. But to go back to Halimat's point about the ale, it's interesting you mentioned it being brought from somewhere else, because if you believe the missionaries, the first one was either Dosumu or Akitoye's mother, right?
Yeah.
One of them, and I wonder where she was from. And that might be a representation of why it was done to honor her,
Yeah.
honor her migration.
Yeah.
So I don't know where she was from.
Mhm.
Like
But
said,
you know about-
Akito's mother was from Bill.
But it's not-
She was a back.
Well,
But
there's a lot,
for
you know,
me, yes.
yeah, it depends on
Yes,
who's-
Yeah.
But what you said reminds me that, if we trace these lineages and these migrations, maybe these things we think of as fundamentally about Lagos are
Exactly.
really fundamentally about
Exactly.
migration
Yeah.
and relationships that we see
Uh-huh.
back and forth.
I think that's what you said about the other stories. I'm sorry, just really quickly. Because what you said was really important about going beyond Lagos, right? Not the central Lagos, but to the central Lagos. at the
Yeah,
same time.
absolutely.
Because what you said made me think, even going back to Losi again, We talked about how all the children of the Gofuminere, they went to Kutemeta,
Mhm.
they went to Sherry, they went to Oto, they went to Ido.
Mhm.
How much time have we really spent in this place?
Exactly.
To really, I mean, going back to what you said about archaeology, right?
Mhm.
These are places with rich material cultures. Like we think about Isheri. I mean, the only person I think about with Isheri is Taiwo, for example. They talk about it from Isheri.
Mhm.
You know, what does it mean for Isheri to be part of Lagos? So how do the people of Isheri connect? Even when you do the excavation of thinking about material culture, that's another way to really bring all these towns in, to really rethink it, not just their ownership, but also rethinking the history of Lagos.
Thank you. I was going to say something about the etymology of Eyo in Lagos varies, and there are about 4 or 5 accounts of it. But prior to Eyo being used as a kind of funeral rite, it had been used first and foremost to solve the fertility problem of Olugbali, the wife of Obali. And it was from that perspective we find out that there are 3 main Orisha instead of 5. You have the Adimu or Adamu Orisha, which in itself is broken into 2. Ogunran and Adimu, male and female. Then you have Oshaoniko and Oshaologe. These are the 3 deities of the Adamu Orisha that were brought not from Iperu, but from Benin by a version. That it was the paraphernalia of the Eyo that was later
changed,
added by Molu and Iperu man, who followed the procession to the worshiping of these deities at modern, what do you call the place now? Around Okepa, thank you, sir. Around that area. So Adimu Orisha started first as a fertility god, and the Europeans account
Which
of
probably explain why when you see them on the morning, they're not wearing they just wear a wrapper and his charms.
Yeah, interesting.
So that shows the extent of the failure of the so-called account by these European-sponsored writers of Lagos history. That Adimu Orisha festival started with the burial of the wife, the family, it preceded that.
Because we all know the story.
I think back to the book, it's just called for us to start rethinking.
That's exactly the pose I was going to make.
The whole process of writing history. Because oftentimes we relied on the archives, and archive itself is a product of politics of identity.
Or some celebrated sources like Loshi and
So as a people, we must begin to think about 1, archaeology, the material culture of Lagos, because beyond Lagos Island, Losi and Buckleyhood concentrated on Lagos Island. But we are going to do a lot of fantastic job for the people if we look at Lagos beyond Lagos. Because there is that connection. Take for instance, what does Losi tell us about Igbo Efon? Just around that. What does it tell us about Okepa? Even what does it tell us about Alausa? The present seat of government.
The entire Eastern district.
If we look at the history of Alausa, for instance, then we can begin to think of why the people of Lagos sees Alausa as their farmstead. What is the connection between Alausa and the present Oshodi?
Yes.
Oshodi.
Yeah.
Do those places, are we talking about 19th century?
Yeah.
Then Agege is a kola reserve, a kola nut farm. How many years does it take a kola nut to grow?
How many?
It's like 10 years, 10, 15 years.
Is that a fact?
Yeah.
So when I pluck a cola,
for you to have a very big kola nut farm in that area, it shows that there are settlements, there are existing civilizations. Because people must live on the farm, survive. And so for us to get the accurate or near accurate history of Lagos, we have to move a bit outside Lagos, start to see that connection. And she has given us the working, what do you call it? A new tool to imagine a city.
yeah, to reimagine.
To reimagine
I
the
just
city.
want to add that even before we get to Alausa or anywhere else, we need to talk about Victoria Island. We need to talk about Ibutimeta, because, and we talk about Ikoyi. Because if you look at the maps of Lagos from the 1870s, 1880s, there's even a really incredible survey of Victoria Island from 1898 And there's so much information about farms, about homes,
Oh,
about crops, about
villages,
about the villages, about
And
settlements,
about
plantations.
20-something
And
villages.
you know, Victoria Island is a relatively recent settlement, so is Ikoyi. So I feel like we could probably even find more information there, because, you know, we focus a lot on Lagos Island and the personalities. But there's so much to be done in Ikoyi and Victoria Island, and I think that this is work that we're always sort of going very far. There's a lot of stuff that's really close, especially that's really recent. And it's funny, like, so can I ask a question? What do we think about the history of Five Cowrie Creek?
Okay, Five Cowrie is one of so close by.
Mm-hmm.
It's a place, or it was a place where before people can cross to the other side of Lagoon, so modern Victoria,
Mm-hmm.
you have to pay 5 pounds.
Why?
But
Because there was a
What
bridge
do you mean by why?
from which people crosses.
But before the bridge, one of the
Yes.
things I've been seeing recently about this is that they used to do baptisms there. A lot of the missionaries,
Yes,
they would
yes.
do baptisms
Oh,
there.
yeah.
No, right there in Five Cowrie Creek, right at the where the Victoria Island can almost meet Lagos Island. And the old name before Five Cowrie Creek is, okay, you're going to laugh at my Yoruba, Odo Alarum.
Okay.
And so.
Alarum.
It's still there now, still there.
Alarum.
Alaro,
No,
Alarum.
Alarum.
Alarm.
That's a sick person.
Oh,
Right.
Alarum.
Alarm,
Okay.
right?
Interesting.
And so I've been finding a lot of this, I was sure.
The river, literally the river of
Yes.
wellness, illness.
Yeah.
Perhaps there's a connection between people who used to worship and heal people there,
Yeah.
and why the missionaries would.
That's
as they-
anthropology coming into,
Exactly.
yes.
And
Yeah.
so missionaries taking people there to be healed, it's probably another layer of people already believe that the water is healing.
Exactly.
So Five Cowrie Creek is a much newer name. And so when we look at this geography of the city, we can see that the city itself it's telling us things. And if we just listen to, I'm really working on a history of the water now. And so if we're thinking, and you have to wonder, why did they put the Colonial Hospital right there, right? In that area near exactly where it was built.
Was it
there.
European?
So there's a there's a sense of people understanding water and power and healing that's embedded right there in the names of these places. So I just think that even the things we take for granted.
the water,
The water.
no, near we have it very close by, Oniko, Igbo-Shere. And yes,
Yeah.
you know, Igbo-Shere, as the name implies, is a forest where people who have committed suicide or who have committed crime, sorry,
Interesting.
are sent into to go and commit suicide.
Really?
Igbo-Shere, but it is part of Oniru's property. And it is where we have the police, Oniko police station now. That's zone 2.
Zone 2.
Yes, around there. And from there, from behind it, you are on 5 Cowrie.
So maybe zone 2, people should be committing suicide.
The water is.
Probably do.
Yeah.
It just strike me that the water factor in Lagos history. Now, if you, I know you know, but Bishi, the
Yes.
19th century Lagos musician,
Yes,
it was of Mahi origin.
yes.
Now, if you look at the antiquity of Mahi people in Lagos,
Wait, water.
yeah, it goes beyond 19th century.
Was yeah.
In fact, some scholars
as
have
early
argued
as the
that they were here
founding of-
before Benin.
Interesting.
Yeah, that they were here before Benin.
But they're transient people, so.
Yeah,
they-
so because if you look at coming from Ondo State through Epe Lagoon down to Aegean, they are always on the coast.
Up to modern Benin.
Modern Benin Republic.
But there is
So we can begin to look at Lagos history, the water factor in Lagos history, and that will tell us a lot.
Yeah, you got your work cut out,
You know,
Yes.
if you tell us a lot beyond Losi, because to me, of course, Losi pioneering work, good work, fantastic work,
Not fantastic.
but with the damage, Losi and Wood have done to
Damage?
people, damage in quotes, is that everybody thinks of Lagos
As a starting point from
Exactly.
Lucia and
Yeah.
Woodward, I mean, you can't believe the
In fact,
number of purported history of Lagos books that are actually just amplifications
Yeah.
of Wood and Lucia.
Yeah.
It's really incredible.
In one of my recent.
I think we're running out of time. but
Okay.
Would you believe that we've been talking for an hour? That's really fun.
Like 30 minutes.
I'm gonna follow up on Dr.
Yeah,
Sunday.
go on.
In one of my books on Lagos recently, I wrote something on Itakuk relations with the Lagos area up to 1967. I used 1967 as a starting point for Lagos State, but the work itself looked at Lagos area, not as Lagos alone. This story about Olofin being the eldest settlers in Lagos is a lot that because before Olofin, even at though there are about 6 communities that were well established before Olofin. Now Olopon, Atidumokon, Abore, Atidumbore, Opelua, at what is the place called now? Where is at it's still there at Ido. Then we have Idofu Sikotas. We have Shemore. We have about 6, and we have Oluwen. All of these were communities that existed prior to the coming of Olofin, and nobody traced their origin to Ife. They were rather traced to communities very near Epe in Egwibeji. So Olofin, Losi's perception of seeing the history of Lagos beginning from Olofin, he said it's normal. And I can say, sir, that these have been documented in what they call Asheru's, Legbe Asheru's family. The people at, yes, you have not heard of that. Asheru was the man that was taken to Benin.
Yes, he was.
Yes, there is Legbe Asheru. Yes, they call themselves Olofin Chieftaincy family. They went to court around 1896. There is that document I saw from, I don't know if it is from Ibadan, about this family, going to court to contest the seizure of lands in Ido area, such that today, most of these people that I mentioned, Olopon, Atidumokon, Abore, Atidumbore, they are all there. The man at Ilobo, Opelua, okay, Idofusi under Alasha and Demo, and Shemore under Oyetole. All of these people lost their properties because the British targeted the area for the construction, first of the railways, and kept asking these people to move to other places. At a point, they stopped compensating them. And in the history of Lagos today, you can hardly hear of those families. They are now buried within the Olotos royal family. And in fact, one of the contending issues in Oto up to today is the struggle over the ownership of Elegba between Opelua and the Oto people. It's a continuous fight that cannot, I don't know when it will be solved, maybe at the Supreme Court.
We all know the involvement of the Olotos and land. And none of it is clear and straightforward. You want to say something about that? I need to say something.
Is, another way we can think about reimagining the past is, why don't we also follow how our historical actors lived and moved, right? For example, how our historical actors lived and moved about the city.
Yeah.
That is also a guiding point for us going back to geography.
Yeah.
Like, I think about when you're talking about Agege and all of these places, Lausa, these were farms, as you said, right? In the newspaper, you see people talking about, like, this person is going to relax on their farm in different parts of the mainland, right? For example, Olajumoke Obasa, she had a farm at Agege. And when I spoke with the late Madukunle, we talked about how she was the one who did the Agege Motor Road, because she wanted to enable people who were bringing their produce and trying to navigate that part of the city to be able to have a smoother time there.
He was a hero.
Exactly. It was for, I think, the Ikija house, or something like that. And you had other people, other families too, who had a farm in that part of the area. And part of why that's also significant is that by thinking through where and how are they moving through the city, we can start to ask questions about those places. Olajumoke Obasa, she loves to walk, right? And unfortunately, she was killed when she was on one of our walks she had a motor accident.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's how she was unfortunately killed, because she really likes to move about the city by walking different places. So going back to what you were saying, in terms of this walking cartography, but also thinking about when we reimagine the past, we have to think about what are the ways in which our historical actors are navigating the city. What are the places that are important to them, right?
Yeah.
And how that also helps to
History of those
connect
places.
exactly the two parts of Lagos in different ways. Because when you think about the island and the mainland, it's like, oh, it's so exhausting and all of this thing. But historical actors, they had a way
Yeah.
of moving about and thinking about the spaces they
Absolutely.
connected to.
Absolutely, and which again brings me back to this favorite phrase from Adeniyi, the landscape and geography as archives. I've always felt, and I'm yet to corroborate it with investigation, that the landscape of Lagos has not always been like this. This intricate movement of rivers, creeks, and lagoons has radically affected how people have lived and how they've survived, and also where and when they lived. So if you just think about modern day Lagos and how so many islands have been joined by reclamation, all right, and how people have moved to live in places that were part of the lagoon and now part of the ocean.
Yeah.
You can imagine that sedimentology and the movement of land over centuries would prove to you that there is a Lagos of 2,000 years ago. And you'd find that I wouldn't find it startling to believe, because if you study the texture of Lagos islands, the islands and the mainland shoreline, it's not very different from the Badagry and the intricate movement of creeks and islands in Badagry. And yet we found industrial salt making 3,000 years old in Badagry.
And also in Lekki.
Wow.
So
That's incredible.
Yeah,
So-
there's
Time
history.
scale.
This is why I said let's go.
The Bejuleki shoreline was populated by the Ijebu people who came there centuries, about 3,000 years ago,
Incredible.
for salt making.
Mm.
For instance, my mother is from Bejuleki, Okunlekwia, but they have up to now family house in Ijebu, right? And most of the families on that shoreline are always coming from Ijebu for salt making. And the issue of salt making in West Africa is not of 19th century.
No, goodness, no, never.
So from there we can begin to rethink, because Lagos is a very fantastic location. It's not possible for Lagos to be empty in the 13th, 14th century, while you have a thriving civilization of
Right
Igbo
next
people right at the
All
next
of
door,
this is also
and
in
they
the
don't want to
names.
come to the shore.
But it's also in the names. When you look at the names, I was looking, we never talk about Dere Deniga, but he
Yeah,
actually tried.
tremendous.
When, and of course, that I don't know if you have
I
the
just
source,
love
but
it.
I've been.
Yeah,
You know,
You have the
this
source?
is- yes, it's from
You're not giving this question. You're not giving.
Christine
Open the
Mann.
door.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have it, I have it.
We have to thank Kristen Mann for this.
Yeah.
But there are so many of these like meeting points and Ebute in Lagos that memorialize these markets. The people coming from all over
Yes.
the mainland.
Yes.
And those names come from before Lucy, from before the 19th century. So what we really need is somebody who really understands the meanings and how we can untangle the translation and names from Ijebu, from here, from there. That's in Lagos, that's older than what we have. This is proof of what even up to Porto Novo market.
Yeah.
But to go back, I wanted to say something that I forgot to say earlier, that obviously I didn't start this walking. I didn't invent, I was not the first person to walk in Lagos. Even I always like to say that when I was walking one day, she knows what I was about to say. I was walking in the Brazilian Quarter one day because I was going to the cemetery. We talked about the traces of people live, also the traces where people died. And I was walking around, the Brazilian Quarter. And then they were like, who are you? And do you know Professor Halimat? I said, yes, I do. They're like, okay, good, you're a real historian. So, Halimat has been embedded in Lagos Island. I'm sure just like you and others, So people have been in the communities and walking and talking to people. It's just a way of can we make a coherent methodology out of this? So, but I was also going to say in my final thinking about archaeology, what's his name? Samuel Crowther. when he defines streets, so I also use a dictionary as a kind of source for etymology. When he defines streets, if you look at it, he talks about intersections a lot and how people put their sacrifices at the intersections. And I wonder if that's a starting point for sedimentology. The layers,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
layers of
Yeah,
this.
Oh, absolutely. There'll be some obvious places to dig,
Mhm.
and there'll be some not so obvious places to dig.
Yes.
Burial sites for sure,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
certainly places where human activity
Mhm.
has been known to
So that's kind of what I was thinking about with these junctions.
Yeah.
And then we have to think about the importance of this to people in this.
Yeah.
And I think that can tell a lot about even Yoruba history, the place of junction,
Mhm.
Orita.
Orita,
Exactly.
Yeah.
in
Thank you.
retrieving people past history.
Yes, absolutely.
So we've covered a lot of ground, and
Learned a lot too.
we've all imparted
Great.
ideas with each other, and it's really been fun. And we must find a way to do this again. But I just would like a final word from each one of you. If you could just take a minute or so, something to say that we could pass on to our audience, to say, this is something new that you can actually contribute to, because many of the biggest custodians of history are actually families
Mhm.
and their memories.
Mhm.
So just try and find something that could advise us all of the academic professionals and the not so academic professionals. Taking from the experience of the Nigerian years.
Okay, well, what I'm trying to say is history has always been an intersection of what happened in the past and at the present, and for the purpose of rebuilding the future. And in that state, historians should continue to look at different sources in arriving at a plausible form of history that people can really enjoy. Aside that, we must always remember the fact that history is about opinion of the historians. Some people will say history is story, somebody's story, but it goes beyond that. It's a conglomeration of various accounts, maybe oral tradition, written records, cartography, or anything that one can lay their hands on. And as E.H. Carr said, this fact lying somewhere, waiting for somebody to come and dust them and then translate them into history. So people should look at history from that perspective, from different sources that can help us rebuild the past.
That was great.
Arimo?
Yes, yeah, I think going back to what you said, it just made me think about the idea of really taking seriously the people that we interview, the custodians, the families as architects and curators. And in terms of like really helping us to navigate and rethink the past in a very different way, because I think we often take them for granted. And that's very important in terms of like reimagining and thinking about new sources. The other thing that I also want to add to that is I'm also thinking about, I'm kind of blanket. Oh yeah, I want to also think about the margins of some of the sources that we read, right? Or even the names can be the guiding spaces and point towards finding new sources. Because sometimes when we see one name, we might think, well, I can't find a lot about it, right? That means it's not important. But the fact that people show up, they're part of what we're reading, they are part of a conversation. We need to think about how can we amplify their voices. Oral interview is one of them, looking at newspaper, obviously talking to a lot of families, also, being in the city, right? And I think goes back to what you said, it kind of goes back to your book in terms of like really thinking about the city as an archive, right? It's a really critical point. But I think really taking oral custodian as a custodian seriously as really architect, people who have a vision that they can help us reconstruct in so many ways through the ways in which they tell us about it. It's also very critical in terms of rethinking sources.
Fantastic.
I think Christian Mann or Margaret, is it Margaret something? City is the people.
Yeah, Margaret Hill.
Margaret Hill.
Yeah.
I mean, Lagos for me, we must help Lagos to rediscover itself because there's a substantial part of Lagos that we are yet to recover. And people must begin to talk. Families, because history shapes identity. It helps us to understand who we are. With Lagos that we are talking about often is 19th century Lagos, European Lagos, but we need to prove that Lagos has a very rich civilization beyond what we are made to understand by Lucy, by Buckleywood, by Christine Mann. And that will tell us a lot about the link from the past, the 19th century, the present, and probably help us to project the future of what the shape of the city will be. She has invented a very nice idea of the history of a city is embedded in right there within the city itself. So we need to start talking about a reimagining of Lagos that is beyond Lucy, beyond Buckleywood, to really tell a fantastic history of Lagos, which is somewhere lying far.
Nice one. I do believe.
Well, I mean, I'll just say quickly, I guess I'll give the non-academic perspective on this one. I'll say two things. Talk to your family members. One of the things that I didn't do is talk to the older people in my family, and they have incredible experiences. Talk to your grandmothers, your grandfathers, your parents, record them. You know, record their versions of history, because that's one thing we don't have. You know, our family experiences. My mother repeat these stories to me, and what I should do is record her and my dad. So talk to your family, find out your histories. Everybody has a history. Every family is the same age. The second thing I say to people guys, look up, whether it's where you work or where you live or where your friends or where you like to hang out. Where are you in Lagos? Where are you in the city? And what does this name mean? Is it a recent name? Is it an old name? What is this place that's meaningful to you? What does the name mean? Can you find that out? I mean, I grew up in a street I didn't understand, was completely linked to the history of Lagos to the 17th century. But I could never understand that connection. I remember it. So like, you know, but well, I spent a lot of time there. But one of the things that, but one of the things is that we're all connected. So everybody, let's look up wherever you are, you know, why, you know, anyway. I'll stop
Fantastic.
there.
Fantastic. So yeah, there's a map, there's a diary, there's a photograph, there's something in
Yes.
your wardrobe and the wardrobe of your grandmother or your auntie. Thank you very much. I must thank you.
Thank
each
you
one of
so
you
much.
for spending time. It's
Thank
been
you.
fun. It's the best 1 hour I've spent in a long time.
Oh, nice. Thank you all.
So
Thank you.
we'll make sure we circulate this and try and teach the people. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
This is good. Everyone, thank you.
That
was great. Thank you.
All right. So you have to.
But for the non-subject,
Very interesting.
Entertaining?
I was wanting, you know, Unicorn here,
Mhm.
was it Stanfield as well?
You know, it's so interesting because I have a friend who runs a place, Bada, like, you know, he wants me to come back to Lagos. And he asked me one day, he's like, Adebde, can you find a map of Oniko on an old map?
guy, both.
Yeah, Folayani
Yeah.
Brown. And it's so fascinating. So I was like, okay, let me go look at my maps. There is no Oniko on the maps until the 1910, 1930. This was just Araromi.
Yeah.
That was this whole area. And I was like,
This is when they do the washing, right?
yeah,
Around,
so
yeah.
all of this place was just Araromi, and then I haven't figured out why, but at some point around like 1980, all of a sudden it's called Oniko. And it's like, this is really fascinating. Because somebody asked me, because they know I have a lot of maps, and I was like, this place wasn't always Oniko. So I don't know. And so if you want to buy a copy.
Are you still rolling? I'm still rolling. Okay, so this is a book.
Go
Right,
to-
go buy it, and it's on Amazon.
No, it's also in Lagos. If you go to Bada, I'm sorry. Imagine Lagos upside down. If you go to Bada, Lagos, it's on Boyle Street, 27. You can get a copy of the book in Naira. Bada, yes, Bada.
That's the company.
Bada, Lagos return at the office of Japa. And
Okay.
so I'm also working on, you know, as I was saying to you, versions that can be more accessible, because this is primarily an academic book. I really want to work with all of us to sort of produce something that even young people can read, something that's more accessible,
Yeah.
something that's more visual. So yeah, so watch this
I
thing.
think without sounding amateur, this is probably one of the best
Really?
books in
It
Lagos.
really,
in
it
that
really
aspect.
is. I read it this weekend. I didn't put it down. I didn't put it down.
The language, the style, the
Well, thank you
techniques
all so much.
is fantastic.
Thank you. Like I said, it has my name, but this is really a labor of so many people. And you know, you saw all of this coming, when I remember I told you about the walking, and
Yeah.
this is where we are now.
Yeah.
And I also talk about people like Pedro Olufeso and they call that I worked with, because, you know, I work with a photographer and another researcher, and they captured so much, and I write about them.
Good.
People behind the history.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
A photograph. Can we get a photograph?
Yeah, absolutely. With my camera too. 'Cause kind of. Act like I know what Instagram is. So I'm gonna give you my camera as well. It's one I stole from. Are we still rolling? I wanted to say something when we're done rolling. Because, you know, the street I grew up on is one of my security questions. So you can maybe black that out.
Yeah,